Hey, kids. As we start out our study of World War II, it's a huge conflict that just, really dominates the entire 20th century and even into the 21st century. Um, but without a doubt, just you can't get away from it in the 20th century in the history of the United States because this is the conflict that puts the United States into the role of a superpower, that which it remains today. Um, but to understand World War II, we really have to go back to the end of World War One, which was a hugely wasteful war that really tore apart the world that had existed even before that. With Britain and France, being kind of the dominant countries of the world and everything, and uh, it all kind of went away with World War One. So that's where we're going to start with the article that we're starting here, which is called "Prelude to War." So let's follow along while I read. World War II was the most devastating war in human history. Over 50 million lives were lost in a 6 year period from 1939 to 1945. When the fighting stopped, the old European balance of power of Britain, Germany, and France was destroyed and replaced by the superpowers of the United States and the Soviet Union. The consequences of World War II are so far reaching that almost a century has passed and the dust of war still has not settled. Every day, all over the world, new conflicts and tensions arise that trace their roots back to the war. In order to gain an understanding of that horrific conflict, one must understand the problems that led to its beginning. And there you see, World War One was called the Great War because they assumed there would never be another one that was possibly as big as that. Well, things changed. When the guns fell silent. The seeds of war were planted the moment that World War I ended. When the armistice went into effect on November 11th, 1918, none of the problems that started World War I were solved. Old hatreds burned more fiercely than ever. Old arguments about colonies and empires went unsolved. Finally, new troubles developed after 4 years of fighting from 1914 to 1918. Most obvious in 1918 was the damage that existed all over Europe. On the Western Front, where the most terrible fighting occurred, large areas of France and Belgium were devastated. Millions of soldiers, as well as civilians, died in battles like Ypres, Verdun, and the Somme. New weapons such as machine guns and poison gas made the death toll enormous. The defeated countries of Germany and Austria-Hungary were on the verge of revolution, and both nations lay in ruins. In Germany, Kaiser Wilhelm II was forced to abdicate his throne and fled to the Netherlands. Afterward, a republic was set up in Germany that became known as the Weimar Republic, after the town where the new government started. In Austria-Hungary, the empire simply collapsed. The Habsburg dynasty, which ruled Austria for hundreds of years, was kicked out, and the empire became a collection of tiny states. Some would become new nations. Others struggled to gain freedom as they were once again ruled by those they considered outsiders. Russia was one of the victorious allies, but the war went so badly for the giant country that it experienced a revolution in 1917. Once the Bolsheviks took over in Russia, they pulled the country out of World War I. Immediately afterward, a horrible, bloody civil war started that turned Russia into the world's largest killing ground for the next 4 years. And there you see kind of what Europe looked like after the war was over. That was a forest at one time. Shady meeting in a French palace. When the remaining allies met in Paris to discuss a permanent peace treaty with the Germans, it became obvious that the British, French, and Americans had very different ideas about the peace process. France, which suffered the most from German invasions in both 1871 and 1914, desired protection for themselves and punishment for Germany. Britain was more willing to be lenient towards Germany as long as the British Empire was intact and the Navy, which protected that empire, remained the strongest in the world. The Americans, led by Woodrow Wilson, came into the war in late 1917 and hoped to spread democracy based around the ideas of Wilson's 14 points plan. Russia, having quit the war, was not invited. Germany went to Paris expecting to be treated fairly. They read Wilson's 14 points and felt reasonably certain they could get decent terms from the Allies. After all, the Kaiser was gone and Germany was now a republic. The armistice was only an agreement to stop fighting, not an admission of defeat. Finally, when the war was stopped, German troops were still deep in France and Belgium. Therefore, they expected to be treated as equals in negotiation. The Germans were shocked and angered when they saw the terms of the Versailles Treaty. In it, Germany was virtually destroyed as a major world power. Germany lost its colonies. The region of Alsace-Lorraine, won in the 1871 Franco-Prussian War, was given back to France. Germany could have no air force, only a tiny navy, and the army was reduced to 100,000 men. Germany was left with nothing more than a national guard rather than a true army. Finally, billions of dollars in reparations had to be paid to the victors, and Germany had to admit that the war was entirely their fault. Knowing that Germany was not strong enough to start up the war again, the Weimar officials reluctantly accepted the treaty. German veterans immediately began to claim that weak politicians and traitors stabbed the German army in the back. In order to deal with Eastern Europe, several territorial changes were made. Austria and Hungary became separate nations. Czechoslovakia and Yugoslavia were created from the dissolved empire. Finally, Poland, which had not been an independent nation since 1750, reemerged from German and Russian territory. The part of Poland that particularly angered the Germans was the Polish corridor, which gave Poland access to the Baltic Sea, but was also historically German territory. It separated the German state of East Prussia from the rest of Germany as well. After 4 years of bloody fighting, nothing was truly solved. The same issues of nationalism and imperialism that started the First World War now threatened to start another. And that very last little tiny paragraph, there are 2 sentences, is really the point of what we just read. They fought for 4 years, millions of people died, and nothing was solved. They pretty much took 20 years off and they went right back to fighting. Now, the cast of characters was a little different, but the countries remained mostly on the same sides. The things that they were angry about were still pretty much the same thing. So, yeah, it ended up just kind of picking up where they left off, and that's what we're going to read about in our next articles.